Ever wondered what it feels like to endure a winter so savage it could literally freeze the breath in your lungs? Picture yourself as a Viking in medieval Scandinavia, where winter wasn't just chilly weather. It was a 6-month death march that would break most modern humans within days. Most folks think they grasp Viking winters, some snow, sub-zero temps, huddling around fires telling tales. But reality was far more terrifying than Hollywood's wildest nightmares. These weren't just cold snaps. They were frozen hellscapes where one wrong move meant you'd never see spring again. Today, I'm revealing 7 horrifying truths about Viking winters that historians rarely discuss. We'll explore how these legendary warriors withstood temperatures that'd kill modern people in hours, why their food storage was literally life or death, and the shocking mental toll of endless darkness. First, let me reset your understanding of winter survival. I've spent years digging through medieval climate records, archaeological finds, and historical accounts to uncover the brutal truth about Viking winters. What I discovered was far worse than I'd imagined. By the end, you'll understand why Vikings became history's most resourceful and ruthless survivors. Here's the mind-blowing context. The Viking Age, 800–1200 CE, occurred during what scientists call the medieval warm period. That's right, these were actually some of the mildest centuries in recent history. If Viking winters were this brutal during warm years, imagine the nightmare when temperatures dropped. Most assume Vikings were naturally cold-adapted superhumans. But here's the truth. They were ordinary people facing conditions that would challenge our best survival tech today. Their only choices? Adapt or die. And their methods were often born of desperation, not heroism. Picture a Viking settlement as winter approached. A cluster of wooden longhouses housing 50 to 100 people along a fjord or valley. Not the stone fortresses from movies. Just large wooden sheds with dirt floors, poor insulation, and leaky roofs. In weeks, this would be buried under feet of snow and temperatures that'd make your winter thermostat weep. Viking winters lasted far longer than ours. Not December to February, but October through April, with the worst stretch bringing weeks without sunlight. In northern settlements, they endured polar night, months of complete darkness. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, even minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. At these extremes, exposed skin freezes in minutes, metal becomes brittle, and breathing turns painful as lung moisture starts crystallizing. You might think they just stayed inside their warm houses, but here's the terrifying reality. Viking longhouses weren't cozy. They were death traps requiring constant maintenance just to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. The central fire pit that provided heat also filled homes with toxic smoke. Without proper chimneys, Vikings faced an impossible choice: freeze to death or slowly suffocate. Smoke was so thick they needed roof holes for ventilation, which let in snow, rain, and freezing air. Imagine trying to sleep in a house where smoke burns your eyes, snow falls on your bed, and indoor temperatures barely stay above freezing despite the constant fire. But the real nightmare wasn't just cold or smoke, it was complete isolation. Once fjords froze, settlements became cut off from the world. No plowed roads, no supply chains, no help if things went wrong. Each community stood alone with whatever supplies they'd stockpiled. This isolation created unbearable pressure. Trapped in a smoky, freezing box with the same 50 people for 6 months straight. No privacy, no escape. Minor arguments could escalate into deadly feuds under these conditions. Viking sagas describe winter as a time when madness and violence flourished. Food was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. Without refrigeration or modern preservation, Vikings relied on smoking, salting, and drying, methods that often failed. If weather was too humid, meat rotted. Too dry, food became inedible. Raiders destroying stores or miscalculated rations meant starvation. Archaeologists find evidence of hunger gaps, periods in late winter when food ran dangerously low but new sources weren't available. Vikings ate tree bark, leather, even animal bones during famines. Their winter diet, salted fish, dried meat, and stored grains, lacked fresh vegetables, causing scurvy and weakening immune systems when they needed strength most. Water was another crisis. Frozen rivers and wells meant melting snow for all water needs, burning precious fuel needed for heat and cooking. Some settlements rationed water, drinking barely enough to survive while conserving fuel. Clothing was woefully inadequate. While we picture Vikings in thick furs, most wore wool layers that turned icy when damp from the longhouse's humid, smoky air. Their leather boots provided little insulation, often freezing stiff. Frostbite was rampant. Skeletons show permanent damage from repeated exposure. The archaeological record shows us skeletons with clear signs of frostbite damage, indicating that this was a widespread problem. The psychological toll of these conditions cannot be overstated. Modern research on seasonal affective disorder reveals how prolonged darkness devastates mental health. Now imagine enduring this before electric lights, when flickering fires and oil lamps provided the only illumination. The perfect storm of endless night, bitter cold, gnawing hunger, and soul-crushing isolation brewed a toxic cocktail of depression and anxiety that would break most modern minds. Viking sagas and historical accounts describe winter as a season when supernatural beliefs intensified dramatically. People reported seeing ghosts, spirits, and otherworldly visions during the darkest months. While we might dismiss these as folklore today, they likely reflected very real psychological distress. Hallucinations, paranoia, and other mental health symptoms became frighteningly common in communities suffering from malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and extreme stress, a medieval version of cabin fever, amplified to lethal extremes. The social fabric of Viking communities underwent dramatic transformations during winter's siege. Farming, trading, and raiding, the lifeblood of Viking society, became impossible, forcing communities to invent new ways to occupy time and maintain order. Storytelling evolved into more than entertainment. It became the glue holding society together, preserving crucial cultural knowledge and preventing social collapse during the endless nights. Those long winter nights birthed the great Viking sagas, epic tales passed down through generations containing everything from navigation secrets to legal traditions. But these storytelling sessions weren't cozy gatherings by the fire. They were desperate lifelines standing between communities and total societal breakdown. In the claustrophobic, high-stress environment of a winter longhouse, entertainment and social rituals transformed into matters of survival. Communities that failed to maintain morale and order during these months often didn't live to see spring. Health challenges extended far beyond what we've covered. The triple threat of poor nutrition, overcrowded living conditions, and weakened immune systems made Viking settlements powder kegs for epidemic diseases during winter. A single sick person could doom an entire community, and without modern medicine or antibiotics, illnesses we consider minor today became mass killers. Childbirth during winter became a deadly gamble. Women delivering babies in the coldest months faced terrifying risks, not just from the birth itself, but from the near impossible challenge of keeping newborns alive in such brutal conditions. Infant mortality rates were already horrifying by modern standards, but winter births faced even grimmer survival odds. Families desperately timed pregnancies to avoid winter deliveries, making reproductive choices literal life or death decisions. Perhaps most terrifying was winter's unpredictability. While Vikings prepared meticulously for typical winters, they had no way to predict when an unusually harsh season would arrive. Climate records show the medieval period suffered wild weather fluctuations, with some winters being dramatically more severe than others. A winter just 20% colder or longer than usual could doom entire communities. Archaeologists uncover settlements abruptly abandoned after particularly brutal winters. Their inhabitants either perished or fled as refugees. These ghost towns, buried under centuries of soil and vegetation, testify to communities that crossed winter's survival threshold. The evidence reveals a terrifying truth modern survival experts are only beginning to grasp. The margin for error in Viking winter survival was essentially zero. One cracked storage barrel, one house fire, one key person falling ill at the wrong moment could trigger an irreversible death spiral. This brings us to perhaps the most overlooked aspect of Viking winter survival: their absolute dependence on perfect community cooperation. Unlike our modern world of individual solutions, call a repairman if your heat fails, go to the store if you're hungry, Viking survival was an all-or-nothing team effort. Every single community member had to contribute flawlessly to the collective survival machine, where everyone died together. This created social pressures unimaginable today. Imagine knowing that if you slacked off, made a mistake, or couldn't pull your weight, you weren't just risking your own life. You might be condemning 50 others, including children and elderly relatives, to horrific deaths. This psychological burden drove Vikings to extreme measures we consider barbaric today. Historical accounts describe heart-wrenching scenarios where communities abandoned their weakest members when supplies ran critically low. Elderly who couldn't contribute left outside to freeze, not from cruelty, but because keeping them alive meant starvation for everyone else. These weren't decisions made by monsters, but by desperate humans facing impossible choices no person should ever confront. Concepts like personal space or individual rights simply didn't exist during Viking winters. Privacy was a lethal luxury. Every resource, every decision, every action had to serve the group's survival. People slept in communal piles not for warmth or companionship, but because separate sleeping arrangements wasted precious heat and space. Personal belongings became communal property because hoarding could doom the entire settlement. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. The social hierarchies of summer months often completely collapsed during winter. A chieftain who commanded respect during raiding season might find his authority challenged by whoever proved most skilled at winter survival management. Women frequently gained power during winter months, as they typically controlled food storage and distribution, becoming literal gatekeepers between life and death. Children were valued not for their potential, but for their immediate ability to perform survival tasks. This social upheaval bred conflicts as dangerous as the external threats of cold and starvation. Viking sagas overflow with stories of winter feuds erupting when normal social structures collapsed under survival pressures. These weren't petty arguments. They were deadly struggles over resources and control that could tear apart communities that had coexisted peacefully for generations. The archaeological record shows us skeletons with clear signs of frostbite damage, indicating that this was a widespread problem. The psychological toll of these conditions cannot be overstated. Viking sleep patterns during winter bore no resemblance to our modern routines. With only a few hours of dim daylight, their circadian rhythms became completely disrupted. They developed what historians call segmented sleep, catching sleep in multiple short bursts throughout the endless night whenever fuel could be spared for warmth and when sheer exhaustion overwhelmed them. This fractured sleep schedule wreaked havoc on their physical and mental health. Modern sleep science shows irregular patterns can cause everything from weakened immunity to severe depression. For Vikings already battling malnutrition and extreme stress, these sleep disruptions compounded their health crises exponentially. Historical accounts describe Vikings growing increasingly irrational and violent as winter progressed, likely fueled by chronic sleep deprivation alongside their other hardships. The labor required just to stay alive was backbreaking and never-ending. Someone had to tend the fires constantly, requiring nightly rotations where people woke every few hours to feed the flames. They regularly cleared heavy snow from roofs to prevent collapse, ventured into deadly conditions to scavenge whatever fuel could be found, and perpetually repaired their shelters as the extreme weather battered them relentlessly. But perhaps the most exhausting battle was the constant war against moisture and mold. The combination of cooking, breathing, and melting snow for water created unbearable humidity inside the longhouses. This moisture would freeze on walls and ceilings, creating ice that melted during the day only to refreeze at night. The endless freeze-thaw cycles caused structural damage requiring constant repairs, while the dampness created ideal conditions for mold and fungus that contaminated precious food supplies. Their tools and weapons, lifelines in normal times, became nearly useless in the extreme cold. Metal tools turned brittle, snapping at critical moments. Wooden handles cracked and split. Leather froze rock solid, becoming impossible to work with. Vikings spent countless hours maintaining essential tools, but often lacked materials for proper repairs. A broken axe or knife could mean the difference between life and death, yet fixing it might require resources they couldn't spare. The animals Vikings depended on suffered just as terribly as their human masters. Livestock had to be brought inside during the worst weather, meaning already cramped living spaces were shared with cattle, pigs, and chickens. These animals produced waste that had to be managed, consumed scarce food resources, and added to the humidity and air quality problems. Yet losing livestock was often worse than the inconvenience. Cows and pigs represented not just food, but also milk, leather, bone tools, and other irreplaceable materials. Vikings went to extraordinary lengths to keep animals alive, sometimes sharing their own dwindling food supplies with livestock when feed ran low. The death of a single key animal could trigger a cascade of problems, dooming the entire community. The most terrifying aspect? The complete absence of backup plans. Unlike our modern world with emergency services, hospitals, and supply chains, Vikings had zero safety nets. When primary survival strategies failed, there was no plan B. Communities in crisis had to improvise solutions with whatever they had on hand, and these desperate measures often sealed their fate. Archaeologists uncover settlements where Vikings attempted increasingly frantic survival strategies as situations grew dire. Evidence shows people burning furniture, tools, even structural parts of their houses for fuel. We find signs they ate leather, bones, anything that might provide nutrition. Some sites show proof of cannibalism when all other food sources were exhausted. These archaeological discoveries reveal winter's ultimate horror. It wasn't just cold and difficult. It was an elimination event that regularly wiped out entire communities. The Vikings we know from history and legend were merely the survivors, the ones who beat impossible odds. For every successful Viking settlement, dozens likely vanished during harsh winters, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and bones to tell their tragic stories. The psychological adaptation required to survive these conditions fundamentally altered Viking worldviews. They developed a stark fatalism where death wasn't something that happened to others or in old age, but a constant companion that could claim anyone at any moment. This acceptance of mortality influenced everything from their religious beliefs to their approach to warfare and exploration. Yet this fatalism also forged an extraordinary fearlessness difficult for modern people to comprehend. When you've survived multiple winters where death lurked daily, facing enemy warriors in battle probably seemed almost mundane by comparison. The legendary Viking courage celebrated in sagas wasn't cultural bravado. It was the practical result of enduring experiences that would shatter most people psychologically. Children raised in these brutal winters grew up with a completely alien relationship to risk, hardship, and survival. Unlike modern children coddled through gradual learning, Viking kids became survival assets the moment they could perform simple tasks. A 5-year-old might be responsible for keeping the fire alive overnight, knowing that if they fell asleep and let it die, everyone in the house could freeze before morning. This early exposure to life or death responsibility created adults capable of making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. But it also inflicted psychological trauma we can scarcely imagine. These children never developed the optimistic, trusting worldview we consider normal. They learned from infancy that the world was merciless, where mistakes had fatal consequences. This knowledge shaped their entire existence. Winter education systems were unlike anything seen in other historical societies. Viking children didn't learn abstract academics. They mastered practical survival skills. But this education was incredibly sophisticated, encompassing weather prediction, resource management, and complex social negotiations. A Viking child surviving to adulthood received survival training rivaling modern military wilderness programs, but at a horrific cost. Children who couldn't master these skills quickly enough didn't get second chances. Communities couldn't support non-contributors, regardless of age. This created brutal evolutionary pressure where only the most adaptable children survived to adulthood. The Vikings' history remembers were products of this ruthless selection process, explaining their legendary competence while hinting at the enormous human cost behind their achievements. The religious and cultural implications of these extreme survival conditions were profound. Norse mythology's emphasis on struggle and conflict wasn't abstract theology. It was a practical framework helping people cope with constant mortality. Concepts like Ragnarok, the world ending in a cataclysmic winter, weren't just stories. They reflected very real possibilities Vikings lived with daily. The promise of Valhalla, where warriors slain in battle feasted eternally, takes on new meaning when you've endured winters wondering if you'd see spring. For people facing slow death by starvation or freezing, an afterlife transforming struggle into eternal celebration wasn't just comforting, it was psychological survival. But the religious practices actually sustaining communities during winter differed dramatically from the flashy mythology. Daily rituals and seasonal ceremonies focused on practical concerns, maintaining cooperation, preserving hope during despair, and reinforcing social bonds to withstand extreme stress. Archaeologists find evidence of elaborate rituals around food storage and distribution, not just practical activities, but sacred ceremonies reinforcing community bonds. Rationing food became a ritual reinforcing shared responsibility, psychologically preparing people for necessary sacrifices. Storytelling traditions served as both entertainment and survival training. Epic sagas allowed mental rehearsal of impossible decisions they might face, choosing between family and community, honor and survival, tradition and adaptation. By confronting these dilemmas through stories, Vikings psychologically prepared for real survival crises. The medical knowledge Vikings developed during their winter ordeals was surprisingly advanced, yet perilously fragile. Communities that devised effective treatments for frostbite, nutritional deficiencies, and psychological disorders gained crucial survival advantages. But this hard-won knowledge often vanished when communities collapsed or when healers died before passing on their wisdom. Archaeological evidence reveals some Viking settlements employed medical interventions that would impress modern researchers. We find traces of surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and mental health strategies suggesting sophisticated understanding of human physiology. Yet other sites show communities lacking this knowledge, suffering devastating losses from conditions their neighbors had learned to manage. This medical inequality created another invisible survival pressure. A settlement with access to advanced healing techniques could weather health crises that would obliterate less knowledgeable communities. But medical expertise was often closely guarded within families or specialist groups, preventing dissemination to settlements that desperately needed it. The psychological techniques Vikings developed for maintaining sanity during endless winters were perhaps their most brilliant and least understood survival innovations. Modern studies on seasonal depression, isolation psychology, and crowd fever give us glimpses of the mental battles Vikings faced. But they had to invent solutions without any scientific framework for understanding these conditions. Successful communities created elaborate systems of social interaction, physical activity, and mental stimulation to prevent psychological collapse. These included organized games, structured work rotations, and communal rituals that gave everyone purposeful tasks. But these interventions required perfect balance with survival needs, forcing Vikings to develop intuitive understanding of human psychology centuries ahead of their time. Winter's impact on Viking family structures was profound and often tragic. The nuclear family model we consider normal was frequently impossible to maintain. Children might be separated from parents and placed with families better equipped to care for them. Elderly relatives could be abandoned when resources became too scarce. Marriage bonds were sometimes broken and reformed based purely on survival needs rather than affection. These family disruptions created psychological wounds that scarred communities for generations. Children raised by multiple caretakers developed attachment disorders, affecting their ability to form stable relationships as adults. Parents forced to abandon family members suffered guilt and depression, impairing their survival capabilities. Yet from this trauma emerged remarkably resilient social structures. Viking communities developed complex systems of adoption, fostering, and extended kinship networks, ensuring children were cared for even if biological parents died. These flexible systems proved far more adaptable than the rigid family structures of other medieval societies. The economic systems Vikings created for winter survival were equally innovative. Normal concepts of property ownership and trade became meaningless during survival crises. Food, fuel, and shelter were distributed based on need rather than wealth. Summer's rich merchants might become winter's dependents, while those with vital survival skills gained temporary authority regardless of normal social status. This created unique social mobility where practical ability trumped traditional hierarchies. Archaeological evidence reveals some communities developed sophisticated resource-sharing systems resembling modern insurance models. Complex networks of mutual obligation spread survival risks across multiple families. But these systems also bred conflict when people failed their obligations or when scarcity made reciprocity impossible. The technological innovations born from winter desperation were often more advanced than Viking summer technologies. Harsh conditions and scarce resources forced development of incredibly efficient tools, building techniques, and resource management systems. But these innovations were highly specialized. Solutions perfected for specific locations couldn't always be transferred elsewhere. Their heating systems were marvels of efficiency given limited materials. Vikings engineered complex air circulation systems distributing heat throughout longhouses while minimizing fuel use and smoke. They developed heat retention techniques, keeping structures warm for hours after fires died. But these systems required constant maintenance by experts. Knowledge easily lost when specialists died. Food preservation and storage methods reached astonishing sophistication. Vikings learned to create natural refrigeration using wind and cold, developing humidity control systems preventing spoilage for months or even years. But these techniques demanded precise timing and ideal environmental conditions. A change in wind patterns or unexpected thaw could ruin months of carefully preserved food. Construction techniques defied primitive stereotypes. Winter shelters weren't crude huts, but carefully engineered structures withstanding extreme weather while maintaining internal climate control. Insulation, weatherproofing, and structural reinforcement methods were remarkably effective given available materials. But perhaps their greatest technological achievement was systems integration. Successful settlements weren't just collections of individual innovations, but perfectly synchronized networks where heating, food storage, construction, and social organization worked in harmony. The failure of any single component could trigger catastrophic chain reactions. A heating system breakdown would spoil food stores, causing malnutrition that prevented repairs to the heating system. Communities that maintained these integrated systems thrived. Those that couldn't collapsed with terrifying speed once synchronization broke down. This explains why Viking settlements succeeded spectacularly in some environments while failing catastrophically in others. Techniques working perfectly in one location could prove disastrous when applied elsewhere without adaptation. The knowledge of how to adapt these integrated systems to new environments was perhaps their most valuable and most vulnerable expertise. Settlements that mastered this became launchpads for further expansion. Those that failed left behind only scattered artifacts and unanswered questions. The ripple effects of Viking winter survival needs extended far beyond Scandinavia. The constant threat of winter starvation drove Vikings to develop sophisticated raiding and trading networks. They couldn't afford self-sufficiency in such harsh environments, forcing them to become exceptional navigators, traders, and warriors. This created a fascinating paradox. The very conditions making Scandinavia barely habitable also forced Vikings to develop skills enabling their legendary expansions. Their winter survival skills translated directly into abilities allowing settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. Navigation skills developed partly from winter necessity became legendary. When your community's survival depended on knowing exactly when to make the last trading voyage before fjords froze, there were no second chances. Viking navigators read weather patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal changes with accuracy rivaling modern meteorologists. Miscalculating these patterns meant being trapped away from home when winter struck, or worse, caught at sea during winter storms. The seasonal trading expeditions Vikings became famous for weren't just economic activities, but desperate survival missions. Communities sent their best warriors and traders on months-long voyages knowing these men might not return, but also knowing that without the resources they brought back, everyone would starve. These weren't casual trips where failure meant trying again next year. The pressure to succeed was absolute. This explains why Vikings risked such extraordinary journeys to acquire goods. But here's what changes everything. Many famous Viking voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and North America weren't primarily driven by adventure or conquest, but by desperate attempts to escape Scandinavian winters. When your homeland regularly experiences winters killing significant portions of the population, sailing into unknown waters to establish new settlements suddenly seems reasonable. It was a calculated risk where potential rewards outweighed the certainty of eventual death if they stayed. The settlement of Iceland around 870 AD perfectly illustrates this winter-driven expansion. These weren't adventurers seeking glory, but refugees fleeing homelands where population growth had made winter survival increasingly precarious. Iceland offered new farmland, untapped resources, and crucially, the chance to establish communities not already at survival's razor edge. What the Icelandic settlers discovered was winters even more brutal than what they'd left behind in Norway. Iceland's volatile volcanic climate created unpredictable weather patterns where temperatures could plummet lethally within hours. The island's exposed North Atlantic position meant storms arrived with little warning, bringing winds that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. These pioneers had to invent entirely new survival strategies on the fly. Many early settlements simply vanished, their inhabitants presumably perishing during particularly harsh winters. What makes Iceland's colonization remarkable was its sheer audacity as a survival experiment with no safety net. These weren't tentative explorers, they burned their bridges, selling everything to fund a one-way journey to an unknown land. They had to make Iceland work or die trying. The archaeological record confirms many did exactly that. Failed settlements dot Iceland's landscape, silent testimony to communities that couldn't adapt quickly enough. The successful ones developed winter strategies even more extreme than mainland Vikings. They learned to harness Iceland's geothermal features, building communities around natural hot springs that provided warmth even in winter's depths. But this created new dilemmas. Geothermal areas were limited and often located in otherwise undesirable locations. Vikings faced impossible choices between access to natural heating and other necessities like fertile soil, fresh water, or defensible positions. Every decision carried life or death consequences. Icelandic Vikings also pioneered new food preservation methods leveraging their environment's unique conditions. They mastered using constant wind and cold as natural refrigeration, achieving preservation beyond traditional smoking or salting techniques. But these methods required flawless timing and precise environmental conditions. A shift in wind patterns or unexpected warm spell could destroy months of carefully stored food, dooming entire communities. The psychological strain of these experimental settlements was crushing. Every choice about resource allocation, construction sites, planting schedules, or livestock management could determine whether a community survived its next winter. The margin for error was even slimmer than in Scandinavia, lacking generations of accumulated local knowledge. This relentless pressure forged a culture of innovation unlike anything else in medieval Europe. Icelandic Vikings couldn't rely on tradition. They operated where conventional methods often failed. Constant experimentation became their lifeline, driving advances in architecture, food storage, and animal husbandry. Successful innovations spread rapidly through Iceland's small population, while failures were quickly abandoned, often along with the communities that tried them. Social structures in these frontier settlements developed unique characteristics. Traditional Viking hierarchies based on martial prowess and wealth became less important than practical survival skills. A person who could predict weather, manage food stores efficiently, or devise new building techniques might gain more respect than a seasoned warrior. This created fluid social dynamics where innovation and practical intelligence were highly valued. But this cultural adaptation came at a terrible human cost. The communities that succeeded were those that could learn from mistakes quickly enough. Those that couldn't adapt fast enough simply disappeared, taking their hard-won knowledge with them. This created brutal evolutionary pressure where only the most resourceful communities survived, but at the cost of losing valuable lessons from those that failed. The religious implications of these extreme survival conditions were profound. Norse mythology's emphasis on cosmic struggle took on new meaning for people routinely witnessing entire communities vanish. The concept of Ragnarok, the world ending in an eternal winter, wasn't abstract mythology but a very real possibility they'd experienced through failed settlements. The sagas emerging from Iceland reflect this heightened awareness of civilization's fragility. Their heroes aren't just brave warriors, but people capable of making impossible decisions to keep communities alive. These stories serve dual purposes, preserving survival knowledge while psychologically preparing settlers for crises. The Greenland settlements established around 985 AD represent Viking winter survival pushed to its absolute limits. Eric the Red's expedition wasn't just exploring new territory, but leading refugees into what amounted to a frozen wilderness, where the survival margin was even narrower than Iceland's. The name Greenland itself was likely history's first recorded case of deceptive marketing, designed to attract settlers to a place more challenging than what they fled. Greenland's Viking communities stretched winter survival techniques to breaking point. The growing season was so short that traditional farming became nearly impossible. Settlements relied almost entirely on hunting, fishing, and trading with indigenous Inuit populations who'd already developed specialized Arctic survival techniques. This created dangerous dependencies. Any disruption to food sources or trade relations could prove catastrophic. Archaeological evidence reveals Greenland settlements constantly teetered on survival's edge. We find traces of people consuming increasingly marginal food sources as conditions worsened: seals, whales, and other marine animals requiring specialized hunting methods. These pioneers had to develop new tools, hunting techniques, and preservation methods while maintaining livestock and farming practices central to their Viking identity. The social pressures in these extreme outposts dwarfed anything in Iceland or Scandinavia. Greenland settlements were so isolated that they might receive news and supplies from Europe only once or twice annually during brief summer months when navigation was possible. This meant any winter crisis had to be endured for months before help could possibly arrive, if it came at all. This crushing isolation exacted a terrible psychological toll. Greenland Vikings lived with the constant awareness that assistance was months away and that any mistake could doom them before rescue was conceivable. This bred a unique form of hypervigilance evident in archaeological finds showing increasingly elaborate food storage systems, defensive preparations, and contingency plans suggesting constant preparation for worst-case scenarios. Climate data from Greenland ice cores reveals these settlements were established during a relatively warm period, but had to endure gradual cooling that made conditions increasingly hostile. What began as challenging but manageable winters became progressively more impossible as the climate shifted. Communities had to constantly adapt to longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and more erratic weather patterns. The final collapse of Greenland's Viking settlements around 1450 AD stands as one of history's most dramatic survival failures. These weren't primitive people. They were descendants of Europe's most capable Arctic survivors with centuries of accumulated knowledge. Their sophisticated techniques had allowed them to thrive where others would perish immediately. Yet, even with these advantages, they ultimately couldn't withstand the combination of climate change, resource depletion, and social isolation marking the late medieval period. Archaeological evidence suggests Greenland's final years saw increasingly desperate measures. People ate their breeding livestock, burned buildings for fuel, and abandoned agricultural practices that had sustained them for centuries. The last inhabitants appear to have reverted to pure hunter-gatherer survival, strategies that might work for nomadic bands but couldn't sustain permanent settlements. Most chilling is how gradually this collapse occurred over generations. People living through it likely didn't realize how dire their situation had become until it was too late. Each winter was slightly harsher than the last, each summer marginally shorter, each year a bit more difficult than the one before. Communities adapted to each incremental change, but couldn't adjust quickly enough for the cumulative effect. This gradual collapse pattern appears frequently in failed Viking settlements across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. Communities would successfully adapt to worsening conditions for years or decades before hitting a tipping point where their survival systems failed catastrophically. The difference between thriving settlements and dead ones could be as slight as one harsh winter or a single key resource becoming unavailable. The Vikings who survived to become historical legends were those who stayed on the right side of this survival equation, but always just one mistake away from joining the countless communities that didn't make it. This reality shaped their entire worldview, creating the famous Viking fatalism and courage that still captures our imagination today. The complete unraveling of Viking winter survival knowledge didn't happen overnight. But when the collapse came, entire ways of life disappeared so thoroughly that modern scholars are still piecing together what these people actually knew. Imagine spending your life mastering survival techniques your ancestors perfected, only to watch your children abandon them as outdated relics. This wasn't just losing practical skills. It was the annihilation of complete worldviews that had sustained human life in impossible conditions for centuries. The most devastating aspect of this knowledge disappearance was its effect on the last survivors who remembered the old ways. Archaeologists uncover individuals who clearly possessed advanced survival knowledge, but lived in communities that could no longer sustain those techniques. We find sites where someone built a sophisticated heating system using traditional methods, while their neighbors used inferior techniques that couldn't maintain the complex infrastructure. These stranded experts must have endured a special kind of psychological torment, possessing knowledge that could save lives, but trapped in societies that no longer valued or supported their expertise. The children raised during this transition faced particularly tragic circumstances. They were often the last generation to receive partial training in traditional survival methods, yet inherited communities incapable of providing the necessary support systems. These children grew up with fragments of invaluable knowledge, but without the cultural context to use it effectively. The archaeological record shows these transitional communities developing hybrid survival systems blending traditional Viking techniques with simpler, less effective approaches that were easier to maintain. These hybrid systems might work during mild winters, but failed catastrophically when challenged by conditions that traditional methods had been designed to withstand. The gradual nature of this transition meant communities often didn't realize how vulnerable they'd become until facing a crisis that revealed their inadequacy. We find evidence of settlements that survived decades using modified techniques, then vanished completely after encountering only slightly harsher than usual conditions. The speed of these failures was matched only by the speed of the knowledge loss itself. Sophisticated survival systems that had been refined over generations could disappear within decades as social and cultural supports eroded. The generational knowledge gap created communities where survival expertise was distributed in the worst possible way. The elderly knew what needed doing, but couldn't physically perform the tasks. The young had the strength, but lacked the knowledge, and the middle-aged were too preoccupied with adapting to changing circumstances to bridge the divide. The psychological impact of watching this collapse unfold must have been devastating. Communities that had once confidently weathered any challenge found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty and internal strife. The social bonds that had held them together during previous crises frayed as people lost faith in their collective survival abilities. Cultural practices that had sustained knowledge transmission were abandoned as communities focused solely on immediate survival needs. Religious and spiritual frameworks that had provided psychological support during darkest hours were replaced by systems not designed for extreme survival conditions. The Viking values of fate, honor, and cosmic struggle gave way to different belief systems that didn't offer the same mental resilience in crisis situations. Individual heroism that had characterized Viking survival efforts was replaced by dependence on external authorities that couldn't provide equivalent support when disaster struck. Economic systems that had enabled winter survival were dismantled during this transition. The intricate resource-sharing networks that had allowed communities to endure extreme scarcity were replaced by market-based systems more efficient in normal times, but far less resilient in crises. Redundant storage systems and cooperative mechanisms that had provided emergency backups were eliminated as economies became more specialized. Political structures underwent similar disruptive changes. The local autonomy that had allowed communities to develop specialized survival techniques was eroded by centralized authorities imposing standardized approaches ill-suited to local conditions. Decision-making processes that had enabled rapid responses to survival threats were replaced by slower, more hierarchical systems. Military organizations transformed in ways that reduced survival capabilities. Viking warrior bands that had provided both defense and survival expertise were replaced by professional military systems with different priorities. The survival skills that had been essential for Viking warriors became irrelevant for soldiers in these new systems. Trade networks that had sustained Viking expansion and survival were disrupted. The long-distance trading relationships that had provided access to crucial resources were replaced by different commercial systems with altered priorities. Knowledge essential for managing resources in isolated settlements became obsolete as communities integrated into larger economic systems. Construction techniques deteriorated as traditional methods were abandoned. The sophisticated knowledge of building structures capable of withstanding extreme weather while maintaining livable interior conditions was lost, replaced by approaches better suited to new political and economic systems, but inferior for survival situations. Traditional materials and techniques became unavailable or were deemed too costly. Food preservation knowledge suffered similar losses. Methods that had kept communities fed through long winters were abandoned in favor of approaches more compatible with new economic models, but less effective in crises. Storage systems and preservation techniques that had been perfected over centuries were discarded as too labor-intensive. Heating systems declined as traditional knowledge disappeared. The intricate understanding of creating efficient heating with limited resources was lost, replaced by systems requiring more fuel but easier to maintain. The complex air circulation and heat retention techniques that had made survival possible were abandoned as too complicated. Water management knowledge deteriorated as well. Techniques for securing and maintaining water supplies during extreme conditions were forgotten, replaced by approaches adequate for normal circumstances but dangerously inadequate during crises. Traditional storage and distribution methods were abandoned as unnecessary. Tool-making skills atrophied without the traditional survival context. The specialized knowledge of creating and maintaining tools that functioned in extreme cold was lost as new economic systems prioritized different qualities. Traditional materials and techniques became scarce or were considered too expensive. Clothing and equipment manufacturing declined similarly. The expertise for creating garments and gear that provided protection in brutal conditions disappeared as social priorities changed. Materials and methods that had been essential became unavailable or were deemed not cost-effective. Transportation knowledge suffered as traditional methods were abandoned. Skills for safe travel during extreme weather were lost as political systems changed. Vehicles and techniques perfected for survival situations were replaced by alternatives better suited to new circumstances but less capable in emergencies. Communication systems deteriorated as traditional practices faded. Methods for maintaining contact during winter isolation were forgotten, replaced by approaches more compatible with new administrative systems but less reliable in survival situations. Traditional signaling techniques were abandoned as primitive. Medical knowledge regressed as traditional healers disappeared. Treatments and remedies that had been essential for surviving winters were lost as new medical systems developed. Effective traditional practices were often dismissed as superstition or deemed unsafe by emerging medical authorities. Psychological support systems collapsed along with other traditional knowledge. Methods for maintaining mental health during prolonged isolation and stress were abandoned as religious and cultural changes took hold. Practices that had sustained communities through winters were rejected as pagan or dangerous. Educational systems that had transmitted survival knowledge were dismantled. The combination of formal instruction, apprenticeship, and cultural immersion that had effectively preserved complex survival skills across generations disappeared as new educational models emerged. Traditional teaching methods were discarded as too informal or unsystematic. Social organization transformed in ways that reduced survival capacity. The balance of individual initiative and community cooperation that had characterized Viking society was disrupted as new political systems centralized authority. Traditional leadership structures that had been essential for survival decision-making were replaced by hierarchies less responsive to local conditions. Resource management systems became less effective as traditional knowledge disappeared. The sophisticated approaches to allocating scarce resources during winters were forgotten as economic systems changed. Traditional storage and distribution methods were abandoned as inefficient. Risk assessment capabilities deteriorated as survival knowledge vanished. The nuanced understanding of evaluating and managing winter survival risks was lost as decision-making became more bureaucratic. Traditional methods for assessing dangers were rejected as too informal or unreliable. Innovation systems declined as traditional knowledge frameworks collapsed. The dynamic processes for developing and implementing new survival techniques disappeared as social priorities shifted. Experimental approaches that had driven Viking adaptation were deemed too risky or wasteful. Quality control mechanisms broke down as survival standards eroded. Methods for ensuring tools, shelters, and supplies met winter survival requirements were abandoned as economic systems changed. Traditional inspection and correction practices were dismissed as unnecessary or too costly. Maintenance systems deteriorated as specialized knowledge disappeared. The rigorous processes for keeping equipment and infrastructure functional during extreme conditions were neglected as priorities shifted. Traditional repair and replacement techniques were abandoned as too specialized or expensive. Backup systems were eliminated as redundancy became viewed as wasteful. The duplicate systems and contingency plans that had provided crucial resilience during winters were abandoned as economic efficiency became prioritized over survival security. Traditional preparation methods were rejected as excessive. Integration systems collapsed as traditional knowledge fragmented. The sophisticated coordination between different survival systems disappeared as specialized knowledge was lost. Traditional methods for synchronizing heating, food storage, construction, and social organization were abandoned as too complex. Monitoring systems deteriorated as traditional practices faded. Techniques for tracking environmental conditions and community status during winters were forgotten as administrative systems changed. Traditional observation and reporting methods were dismissed as primitive or unreliable. Documentation systems declined as survival knowledge disappeared. Methods for preserving and transmitting essential information through oral traditions and practical demonstration were lost as educational systems formalized. Traditional knowledge transmission practices were abandoned as too informal. Testing systems atrophied without survival context. Processes for evaluating new techniques and equipment under realistic winter conditions were abandoned as priorities shifted. Traditional validation methods were rejected as too dangerous or impractical. Optimization processes disappeared along with survival knowledge. Methods for refining techniques and improving survival systems incrementally were lost as immediate needs overshadowed long-term preparation. Traditional continuous improvement practices were abandoned as unnecessary. Adaptation systems collapsed as traditional knowledge frameworks unraveled. The dynamic processes for modifying techniques to changing conditions disappeared as flexibility became less valued than standardization. Traditional adjustment methods were rejected as too unstable. Recovery systems deteriorated as survival knowledge vanished. Techniques for rebuilding capabilities after winter disasters were forgotten as resilience became less prioritized than efficiency. Traditional restoration methods were abandoned as too time-consuming. Emergency response systems declined as traditional practices faded. The rapid reaction protocols that had saved communities during sudden winter crises were lost as decision-making became more centralized. Traditional intervention methods were dismissed as too disorganized. The final collapse of Viking winter survival knowledge represents one of history's great tragedies, not just for the communities that perished, but for humanity's collective wisdom. These weren't primitive techniques being replaced by superior methods, but sophisticated systems perfectly adapted to their environment that disappeared due to social and cultural changes unrelated to their effectiveness. The archaeological record paints a heartbreaking picture of this comprehensive collapse. We find settlements where people clearly still understood traditional survival methods, but could no longer implement them effectively. There's evidence of half-built sophisticated heating systems abandoned mid-construction, communities that started projects using ancestral knowledge but lacked the social organization or resources to complete them. Other sites showed desperate improvisations, attempts to recreate traditional techniques without the proper materials or expertise, often with tragic results. The human cost of this systemic failure was enormous, yet largely invisible to those driving the changes. Political leaders, religious authorities, and economic reformers implementing these transformations had no understanding of what they were destroying. They viewed Viking winter practices as primitive holdovers from a bygone era, inefficient, superstitious, or incompatible with modern medieval civilization. No one realized they were dismantling some of the most sophisticated survival systems humans had ever developed. Even the communities experiencing this collapse often didn't comprehend what was happening until it was too late. Individual changes seemed like minor adaptations or improvements, more efficient ways of organizing labor, better integration with regional trade networks, adoption of new religious practices. Only when facing a true winter crisis did they discover how these incremental changes had eroded their survival capacity beyond recovery. The tragedy extends far beyond the immediate communities affected. The loss of Viking winter knowledge eliminated specialized adaptation strategies that might have proven invaluable for later human expansion into challenging environments. The social structures, cultural practices, and integrated problem-solving approaches that supported these capabilities were lost as well, potential models for human organization in extreme conditions. The lessons from this collapse remain critically relevant today. They demonstrate that even the most advanced survival systems can disappear alarmingly fast when their social and cultural foundations erode. They prove knowledge preservation requires constant active maintenance. Passive storage in books or artifacts isn't enough. Most importantly, they reveal that human survival in extreme environments depends not just on technical knowledge, but on living social ecosystems that must be consciously sustained. Modern humans now face our own environmental challenges and consider expansion into extreme habitats, from deep space to ocean depths. The Viking experience teaches us that success requires more than technology alone. We must cultivate the social systems, cultural values, and psychological frameworks that allow survival knowledge to remain viable across generations. Their collapse warns against prioritizing short-term efficiency over long-term resilience, or sacrificing localized expertise for standardized systems. The Vikings proved humans can thrive in seemingly impossible conditions through sophisticated cultural adaptation. But their disappearance also shows how fragile these adaptations are when social contexts change. As we confront climate change and other existential threats, their story offers both inspiration and caution, a reminder that survival depends not just on what we know, but on how we maintain the societies that make that knowledge meaningful. The psychological frameworks supporting Viking winter survival were equally remarkable and equally vulnerable. The fatalistic courage that characterized Viking culture wasn't innate temperament, but cultivated mindset, the product of generations surviving conditions where death was a constant companion. Children raised with this worldview could make impossible decisions under extreme pressure because they've been psychologically prepared since infancy. Modern research confirms what Vikings intuited, that human performance in crisis depends heavily on mental preparation. The sagas and rituals that seem like quaint folklore were actually sophisticated psychological programming. By immersing each generation in stories of heroes overcoming impossible odds, Vikings conditioned minds to perceive challenges as conquerable rather than overwhelming. Their religious concepts like Valhalla took on profound psychological significance. The promise of an afterlife where winter's struggles transformed into eternal feasting helped people endure present hardships. This wasn't naive escapism, but a cognitive reframing technique, a way to make suffering meaningful and thus endurable. Modern psychology recognizes such meaning-making as crucial for resilience. The social structures supporting Viking survival were equally innovative. They balanced individual autonomy with collective responsibility in ways that maximized both motivation and cooperation. Modern organizational theory is only now rediscovering these principles, that people perform best when they have personal ownership but also shared purpose. Viking systems achieved this balance organically through survival necessity. Their economic models blended private ownership with communal sharing in ways that maintained incentives while ensuring collective survival. Modern economic systems still struggle to achieve this balance, either over-prioritizing individualism at the expense of community resilience or suppressing initiative through excessive collectivism. Viking winter economics offer a middle path we've largely forgotten. The educational approaches were remarkably effective at transmitting complex survival knowledge across generations. Combining storytelling, apprenticeship, and hands-on experience created robust learning systems where knowledge wasn't just memorized but embodied. Modern education often struggles to achieve similar depth of practical mastery, particularly for specialized skills. The technological integration Vikings achieved remains impressive even by modern standards. Their ability to coordinate heating, construction, food storage, and social organization into seamless survival systems anticipates modern systems engineering. Yet they accomplished this without formal training, driven purely by environmental necessity. Perhaps most impressive was their capacity for decentralized innovation. Viking communities constantly experimented with new techniques and adapted successful ones rapidly, a process resembling modern agile development or lean startup methodologies. This allowed continuous improvement despite limited communication between distant settlements. The loss of these capabilities represents more than historical curiosity. As climate change creates new environmental challenges, we may need precisely the kind of adaptable, resilient systems Vikings perfected. Their knowledge could have provided valuable models for sustainable Arctic living, extreme environment architecture, or cold weather agriculture. Similarly, as we contemplate human expansion into space or other extreme environments, Viking approaches to isolation psychology, closed system resource management, and crisis decision-making could offer valuable insights. NASA and other organizations now study historical examples of isolated communities precisely because Vikings faced similar challenges centuries earlier. The military implications are equally significant. Modern special forces and survival experts recognize Viking winter skills as anticipating many contemporary survival techniques. Their ability to operate effectively in extreme cold with minimal equipment remains impressive even with modern gear. The loss of this knowledge left later generations to relearn these lessons painfully. Medical knowledge lost in the collapse could have proven valuable as well. Viking treatments for frostbite, hypothermia, and nutritional deficiencies developed through centuries of trial and error disappeared just when they might have benefited later Arctic explorers and settlers. Modern medicine has had to rediscover many of these insights through new research. The psychological techniques for maintaining group cohesion under stress could have informed modern organizational psychology. Viking methods for preventing conflict in confined spaces, maintaining morale during prolonged hardship, and making tough communal decisions under pressure anticipated challenges now studied in Antarctic research stations and submarine crews. Even Viking approaches to time management under extreme conditions offer lessons. Their segmented sleep patterns, task prioritization during brief daylight hours, and seasonal activity cycles represent sophisticated adaptations we're only now beginning to appreciate through chronobiology research. The economic models balancing short-term needs with long-term survival planning could inform modern sustainability efforts. Viking systems ensured immediate needs were met without compromising future generation survival, a principle modern economics often fails to achieve despite advanced technology. Ultimately, the Viking collapse teaches us that advanced survival capabilities depend on cultural ecosystems as delicate as they are powerful. These systems can't be preserved in museums or books alone. They require living communities practicing and transmitting the knowledge continuously. When that chain is broken, even the most sophisticated techniques can disappear within generations. As we face our own environmental and societal challenges, this lesson grows increasingly urgent. The Vikings showed humans can adapt to nearly any condition, but only by maintaining the cultural frameworks that make adaptation possible. Their disappearance warns us that survival isn't guaranteed by past success, and that the systems sustaining our own civilization may be more fragile than we imagine. The final chapters of Viking winter survival knowledge unfolded with terrifying speed. Archaeological evidence shows settlements that had stood for generations could vanish completely between one winter and the next, not gradual declines, but sudden catastrophic collapses where every survival system failed simultaneously. These weren't communities slowly fading away. They were complex societies hitting an invisible threshold where their adapted systems could no longer function. Imagine the psychological horror for neighboring settlements discovering an entire community had perished, men, women, and children frozen or starved in their longhouses. These weren't primitive people succumbing to expected hardships, but sophisticated survivors who had weathered decades of winters before encountering conditions that exceeded their adapted capacity. Such discoveries must have sent shockwaves through surviving communities, creating existential dread about their own vulnerability. This terror of sudden collapse explains the increasing desperation of later Viking expansion efforts. When communities lost confidence in their ability to survive in traditional territories, they gambled everything on establishing new settlements in completely unknown lands. The famous voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland weren't primarily about exploration or conquest. They were desperate refugee movements, attempts to escape from survival systems people knew were failing. The Greenland settlements represent the absolute extreme of this survival calculus. By the time these colonies were established around 985 AD, Viking society had already developed centuries of winter survival knowledge. Yet the Greenland pioneers chose to relocate to an environment even more hostile than what they'd left behind, a decision that only makes sense as an act of desperation. They weren't seeking better lives, but any possible life when staying put seemed increasingly untenable. For nearly 500 years, these Greenland Vikings clung to existence at civilization's edge. They adapted their already specialized survival techniques to conditions that would have killed unadapted Europeans within days. Their settlements developed ingenious solutions, hunting strategies borrowed from Inuit neighbors, innovative uses of scarce resources, and social structures maximizing cooperation under constant stress. Yet the archaeological record shows these communities existed in perpetual decline from their founding. Each generation had slightly fewer resources, slightly less knowledge, slightly worse conditions than the one before. They fought this decay with remarkable ingenuity, but like swimmers against a rising tide, their efforts only delayed the inevitable. By the mid-15th century, even these most resilient Viking survivors had disappeared. What makes Greenland's collapse particularly chilling is how ordinary it appeared to those living through it. Unlike sudden catastrophes that leave clear evidence of violent ends, these communities faded gradually. Families ate slightly poorer food each year, abandoned marginally more farmland to frost, made slightly more compromises in their building standards. The changes were small enough that no single winter stood out as the breaking point. Until one year, no one remained. This pattern holds terrifying lessons for modern societies. The Vikings didn't fail because they were primitive or incompetent. They were arguably the most capable cold weather survivors Europe ever produced. Their systems failed because small, seemingly reasonable changes accumulated until the entire structure lost resilience. By the time the danger became obvious, it was too late to reverse course. Modern climate researchers see similar patterns in threatened Arctic communities today. Indigenous groups with generations of adaptation knowledge find their survival systems undermined not by any single factor, but by the gradual erosion of cultural, environmental, and economic supports. Like the Vikings, they often don't recognize the crisis until the systems are beyond saving. The loss of Viking winter expertise created a historical amnesia that proved deadly for later Europeans. When new waves of Arctic exploration began in the 16th century, explorers had to relearn through tragic trial and error what Vikings had known centuries earlier. Countless expeditions perished from mistakes Viking children could have avoided: improper shelter construction, inadequate food preservation, poor understanding of seasonal patterns. This knowledge gap had staggering human costs. Historians estimate thousands of later European settlers and explorers died in conditions Viking communities had routinely survived. The infamous Franklin expedition of 1845, where 129 men perished in the Arctic, represents just one highly publicized example. Their fate might have been different had Viking winter knowledge not been lost. The military implications were equally significant. From the 30 Years' War to Napoleon's Russian campaign, European armies repeatedly suffered catastrophic losses in winter conditions Viking warriors had considered manageable. Military historians note that Viking raiding parties routinely operated successfully through winters that would immobilize later medieval armies. Even basic survival skills became mysteries after Viking knowledge disappeared. Simple techniques like creating insulated shelters, preventing frostbite, or maintaining nutrition in winter, common knowledge during the Viking Age, had to be painfully rediscovered by later generations. Arctic explorers' journals from the 18th and 19th centuries read like beginners attempting skills the Vikings had mastered as children. The economic consequences persisted for centuries. Northern European settlements that had thrived during the Viking Age became marginal backwaters as winter survival knowledge declined. Trade routes that had operated year-round became seasonal, reducing economic activity. Agricultural productivity declined as frost-resistant techniques were forgotten. Cultural losses were equally profound. The sagas, myths, and oral traditions that had encoded survival knowledge became fragmented and misunderstood. Later generations preserved the stories as literature but lost the practical wisdom embedded within them. What had been survival manuals became fairy tales. Perhaps most tragically, the disappearance of Viking winter expertise coincided with the onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that lasted from the 14th to 19th centuries. The precise survival systems that could have helped Europe weather this climatic shift had just been lost. Historians speculate how differently events might have unfolded had Viking knowledge remained intact. The parallels to modern climate challenges are unsettling. Today, as we face environmental changes comparable to those the Vikings adapted to, we've lost much of their hard-won knowledge. Indigenous Arctic groups now serve as crucial sources of resilience. But like the Vikings, their traditional knowledge systems are under threat from globalization and cultural change. The Viking collapse demonstrates that survival knowledge isn't just information but an ecosystem, requiring continuous practice, social reinforcement, and cultural transmission. Like a living language, it can't be preserved in dictionaries alone, but needs communities of active speakers. When that ecosystem breaks down, knowledge disappears regardless of how advanced it once was. This lesson carries urgent implications for preserving modern expertise. From pandemic preparedness to climate adaptation, we rely on specialized knowledge that could prove equally fragile if not actively maintained. The Viking experience warns against assuming our civilization's knowledge base is permanent or self-sustaining. Their disappearance also challenges our assumptions about progress. We imagine history as a steady accumulation of knowledge and capability. The Viking collapse proves otherwise, that advanced adaptation systems can be lost, leaving societies more vulnerable than their ancestors. In an era of climate change and ecological instability, this is a warning we cannot afford to ignore. The psychological dimensions of Viking winter survival represent perhaps their most sophisticated and most fragile adaptation. Modern research into polar expeditions and space missions confirms what Vikings intuitively understood, that mental resilience matters as much as physical preparation in extreme environments. The Viking approach to psychological survival wasn't accidental, but a carefully cultivated system passed down through generations. Children were conditioned from birth to view hardship as normal and survivable. Unlike modern children shielded from life's harsh realities, Viking youngsters participated in survival tasks as soon as they could walk. A 5-year-old might be responsible for keeping embers alive overnight, not as play, but with the understanding that everyone would freeze if they failed. This created what psychologists now call stress inoculation. Early exposure to manageable challenges builds resilience for greater ones later. The sagas served as psychological training tools, immersing listeners in stories of heroes overcoming impossible odds. Modern special forces use similar stress exposure training to prepare soldiers for combat. Viking children didn't just hear these stories, they practiced the skills described, mentally rehearsing survival scenarios until responses became automatic. When real crises hit, they didn't panic but implemented solutions they'd imagined countless times. Religious beliefs were similarly practical. The Norse concept of fate wasn't passive resignation but active acceptance of life's uncertainties, what modern psychology terms radical acceptance. Vikings believed their actions mattered precisely because outcomes were uncertain. This created a mindset modern therapists strive to cultivate. Focus on what you can control, accept what you can't. Community rituals maintain psychological stability through winter's darkest months. The repetitive tasks of food preparation, tool maintenance, and fire tending weren't just practical necessities, but meditative practices. Modern research shows such rituals reduce anxiety by providing structure and predictability in chaotic environments. Viking winter life was carefully structured to prevent the idleness and unpredictability that breed conflict in isolated groups. Leadership structures adapted fluidly to winter conditions. The summer's warrior chiefs often yielded authority to those with survival expertise when temperatures dropped. This flexibility anticipated modern understandings of situational leadership, that different crises required different leadership styles. Viking communities instinctively recognized that winter's challenges demanded different skills than summer's raids. Conflict resolution methods were equally advanced. The same communities that produced fierce warriors also developed sophisticated mediation techniques for winter months. With violence representing an existential threat in confined winter quarters, Vikings cultivated negotiation skills that would impress modern diplomats. Archaeological evidence shows weapons were often stored ritually during winter, symbolically emphasizing peaceful resolution. The psychological toll of making life or death decisions for entire communities left its mark. Viking sagas are filled with leaders agonizing over impossible choices, rationing food, abandoning the weak, risking dangerous journeys. Modern studies of disaster responders show similar psychological burdens. The Viking solution was communal decision-making, spreading responsibility to prevent any individual from breaking under the weight. Child-rearing practices fostered remarkable independence while maintaining strong community bonds. Viking children were given real responsibilities, but never left to struggle alone. This balance between autonomy and support created adults capable of both decisive individual action and seamless cooperation, qualities modern education systems struggle to cultivate simultaneously. The concept of personal honor served crucial psychological functions. In an environment where individual mistakes could doom many, honor codes created powerful social enforcement of careful behavior. What might seem like primitive pride was actually a sophisticated quality control system. The knowledge that one's reputation hinged on perfect performance motivated extraordinary care in survival tasks. Winter's social transformations had psychological benefits we're only now understanding. When women gained authority over food distribution during winter, it created more collaborative decision-making styles. Modern organizational psychology confirms that diverse leadership groups make better crisis decisions. Vikings discovered this through necessity. The alternating seasonal lifestyles, summer's individualism and winter's collectivism, may have provided psychological benefits similar to modern work-life balance. Just as office workers need vacations from routine, Vikings benefited from radically different social structures in different seasons, preventing the stagnation that comes with unvarying conditions. Storytelling's psychological functions were multifaceted. Beyond preserving knowledge, sagas provided escapism during confinement, reinforced community values, and allowed safe exploration of controversial topics through allegory. Modern psychology recognizes such narrative practices as crucial for group cohesion in high-stress environments. The Viking approach to failure was remarkably modern. While winter's stakes were unforgiving, their culture recognized that even the best preparations sometimes failed. Sagas are filled with heroes who make mistakes but redeem themselves, a narrative structure that encouraged learning from failure rather than being paralyzed by it. Mental health maintenance was woven into daily life. The communal nature of Viking winter existence meant signs of psychological distress were quickly noticed and addressed. Modern isolated societies could learn from this embedded approach to mental health care, where support wasn't a separate system but part of community fabric. The seasonal rhythms of Viking life may have provided natural protection against depression. The intense social bonding of winter gave way to summer's more independent living, a cycle modern researchers find may prevent the social burnout that comes with constant interaction while avoiding the loneliness of permanent isolation. Viking humor, as recorded in sagas, served as a pressure valve for tension. Their jokes often centered on winter hardships, not to trivialize them, but to gain psychological distance. Modern crisis psychologists use similar techniques, helping people reframe challenges through humor without denying their severity. The psychological innovations Vikings developed for winter survival represent a lost treasury of human adaptation. Their approaches to leadership, decision-making, conflict resolution, and mental health maintenance were perfectly tailored to extreme environmental pressures. That these sophisticated systems could disappear so completely warns us how fragile such hard-won knowledge can be. Modern attempts to recreate Viking psychological resilience often miss crucial context. Wilderness survival schools teach Viking techniques, but lack the cultural framework that made them sustainable. Military units study Viking combat ethos, but not their seasonal psychological adaptations. The true lesson isn't in isolated techniques, but in the integrated systems that supported them. As we face increasing psychological challenges from climate change, pandemics, and social fragmentation, Viking approaches offer valuable insights. Their ability to maintain mental health in prolonged crises, make impossible decisions under pressure, and balance individual needs with group survival holds lessons we're only beginning to appreciate. The disappearance of these psychological systems represents one of history's great intellectual losses. Just as we'll never know all the medicinal uses of plants lost to deforestation, we can only guess at the full sophistication of Viking mental resilience techniques. What fragments remain suggest we've lost an entire school of practical psychology developed through centuries of extreme adversity. Perhaps the most important psychological legacy is the Viking proof that humans can adapt mentally to almost any circumstance. Their example shows that courage, resilience, and ingenuity aren't fixed traits, but skills that can be cultivated given the right social and cultural supports. This message of hope, emerging from one of history's harshest survival challenges, may be their most enduring gift. The disappearance of Viking winter survival systems created a historical blind spot that distorted our understanding of human capabilities. For centuries after the Viking Age, Europeans viewed the Arctic as an unconquerable wasteland, forgetting that their ancestors had not just survived but thrived in these conditions. This collective amnesia illustrates how quickly even the most advanced adaptations can vanish from cultural memory when supporting systems collapse. Archaeological discoveries in recent decades have forced a dramatic reassessment of Viking winter capabilities. At Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland, scientists uncovered a Viking settlement that functioned as a winter camp, proving they could establish footholds in climates far harsher than Scandinavia's. The site's artifacts reveal sophisticated cold weather technologies, reinforced dwellings with advanced insulation, specialized footwear for snow travel, and tools adapted for frozen conditions. Equally impressive are the Greenland settlements' remains, where Vikings maintain European livestock and agricultural practices in an environment that challenges modern farmers. Their barns and byres show ingenious adaptations, elevated floors for warmth, windbreak configurations, and manure management systems that turned waste into insulation. These weren't primitive people barely scraping by, but skilled specialists who had transformed their survival knowledge into precise technological systems. The scale of their lost knowledge becomes clear when comparing Viking capabilities to later Arctic explorers. While 18th century expeditions suffered catastrophic losses from scurvy, Vikings had developed effective, if imperfect, anti-scurvy measures through winter greens preservation. When 19th century explorers perished from hypothermia, they lacked the layered clothing systems Vikings had perfected centuries earlier. Even simple innovations like snow goggles, which Vikings crafted from walrus ivory with narrow vision slits to prevent snow blindness, had to be reinvented by later Arctic travelers. Perhaps most striking is the contrast in winter mobility. Viking sagas describe routine journeys between Greenland and Norway during months later sailors considered unnavigable. Archaeological finds confirm they maintained this mobility through advanced ship technologies, reinforced hulls, specialized sails for icy winds, and navigational techniques attuned to winter conditions. This capability disappeared so completely that by the 1700s, European ships couldn't safely approach Greenland for half the year. The economic implications of this lost knowledge were profound. Viking trade networks operated year-round, with winter routes following ice patterns and currents they understood intimately. When this knowledge vanished, Arctic trade became seasonal, reducing economic activity by half in some regions. Settlements that had thrived as winter trading hubs declined into poverty, their strategic advantages forgotten. Military capabilities similarly regressed. Viking armies routinely campaigned through winters that would immobilize later medieval forces. Their winter warfare techniques, from ski-mounted troops to insulated base camps, gave them strategic advantages no European army would regain until modern times. The loss of these capabilities reshaped Northern Europe's power dynamics for centuries. Medical knowledge suffered particularly dramatic losses. Viking treatments for frostbite, hypothermia, and winter infections, developed through generations of trial and error, disappeared just when they could have benefited later Arctic settlements. Modern analysis of skeletal remains shows Viking populations had lower rates of cold weather injuries than 19th century Arctic explorers, suggesting their preventive measures were remarkably effective. Nutritional science also regressed. Viking methods for preserving vitamins through winter fermenting greens, drying berries with care to retain nutrients, specific animal organ consumption, were abandoned and had to be rediscovered through modern nutritional science. The hunger gaps that became common in medieval northern Europe were largely absent during the Viking Age, thanks to their sophisticated food preservation systems. Psychological resilience similarly declined. Later accounts of Arctic exploration are filled with descriptions of mental breakdowns and group conflicts that Viking sagas rarely mention, not because Vikings were superhuman, but because their cultures had institutionalized psychological coping mechanisms we're only now rediscovering. The social costs of these losses are incalculable. Communities that had maintained stable populations for generations under Viking systems saw dramatic increases in winter mortality as knowledge disappeared. The demographic impacts persisted for centuries, with some northern regions not regaining Viking-era population levels until the 20th century. Technological regression was equally severe. Viking innovations like the staved church construction technique, which created well-insulated, weatherproof structures, were replaced by inferior building methods. Later medieval buildings in the same regions show poorer insulation, worse ventilation, and higher maintenance needs, all factors that increased winter mortality. The most tragic aspect is how unnecessary these losses were. Viking knowledge didn't disappear because it was ineffective, quite the opposite. Their systems worked so well that people stopped noticing their importance until it was too late. Gradual social and economic changes eroded the cultural context that sustained this knowledge, like trees being cleared from around a lake until the water finally evaporates. Modern attempts to reconstruct Viking winter technologies reveal their sophistication. Experimental archaeologists building replica Viking longhouses are consistently surprised by their effectiveness, maintaining stable temperatures with minimal fuel, managing humidity better than some modern structures, and withstanding storms that damage contemporary buildings. Similarly, recreations of Viking winter clothing prove far more effective than expected. Their layered wool and leather garments provide better insulation and moisture control than many modern materials, while allowing greater mobility. Tests show properly equipped Viking reenactors can sleep comfortably in open shelters at temperatures that would endanger someone in modern winter gear. Food preservation experiments yield equally impressive results. Viking methods can keep meat edible for over a year without refrigeration, outperforming many medieval techniques and rivaling modern approaches. Their fermentation techniques preserve nutrients in ways that prevent deficiency diseases common in later Arctic populations. Perhaps most telling are the psychological effects noted during these reconstructions. Participants report developing mindsets strikingly similar to those described in Viking sagas: a pragmatic focus on solvable problems, reduced anxiety about uncontrollable factors, and strong group cohesion under stress. This suggests Viking winter psychology wasn't just cultural, but emerged naturally from their survival system's effectiveness. The implications for modern winter preparedness are profound. As climate change makes extreme weather more common, Viking adaptations offer proven solutions to many challenges we face. Their building techniques could inform energy-efficient housing. Their clothing systems could improve winter gear. Their food preservation methods could enhance food security. More importantly, Viking systems demonstrate that human survival in extreme conditions depends not on any single technology, but on integrated systems encompassing tools, techniques, social structures, and psychological frameworks. This holistic approach, largely forgotten during the industrial era, may hold keys to sustainable living in our changing climate. The greatest lesson from Viking winter knowledge may be humility. Their disappearance proves that no adaptation, no matter how advanced, is permanent. Survival capabilities must be actively maintained and transmitted, or they will vanish, taking with them hard-won wisdom we may desperately need in the future. As climate uncertainty grows, remembering this lesson could make the difference between resilience and collapse. The gender dynamics of Viking winter survival reveal some of history's most sophisticated and overlooked social adaptations. While summer's raiding season was male-dominated, Winter survival hinged on traditionally female domains like food management, textile production, and healthcare. This seasonal power shift created a remarkable gender balance that most medieval societies lacked. Women's authority over winter food stores made them literal life givers, a responsibility that translated into social influence far beyond domestic spheres. Archaeological evidence shows women's graves from Viking winter settlements often contain keys, not just to food storage chests, but to community granaries. These weren't merely household managers, but administrators of collective survival resources. In some settlements, women's graves contained scales and measuring tools, suggesting roles we'd now call rationing officers or supply chain managers. The sophistication of Viking winter food distribution systems, with precise measurements and recorded allocations, anticipates modern emergency management practices. Textile production was another female-dominated survival essential. Viking winter clothing required astonishing amounts of wool. Estimates suggest each person needed the annual fleece of 15 sheep just for basic garments. Producing these clothes wasn't casual domestic work, but industrialized scale survival production. Experimental archaeology shows creating a single Viking-era wool tunic required over 400 hours of skilled labor: spinning, weaving, sewing, and waterproofing. The social implications were profound. Women controlled access to clothing essential for winter survival, giving them economic leverage unusual for medieval societies. Textile workshops in larger settlements show evidence of specialization and quality control that would impress modern manufacturers. Some Viking women literally held community survival in their hands, their spinning wheels and looms as crucial as any warrior's sword. Healthcare was another female stronghold with winter survival implications. While sagas glorify male battlefield medicine, women provided the preventative healthcare that kept communities alive through winters. Herbal remedies for scurvy, nutritional balancing to prevent deficiency diseases, and midwifery knowledge to ensure healthy births all fell under women's domain. Archaeological finds of medicinal plants in Viking settlements show sophisticated understanding of preventative care, knowledge that disappeared along with other winter survival systems. Child-rearing practices adapted ingeniously to winter constraints. Viking women developed communal childcare systems where children rotated between households, ensuring no single family bore the full burden of winter childcare while also preventing disease spread through isolated groups. This system created resilient social networks where children developed bonds with multiple caregivers, an approach modern psychology recognizes as beneficial for childhood development. The psychological support women provided was equally crucial. Viking women weren't just physical caretakers, but emotional anchors during winter's psychological strains. The sagas are filled with wise women resolving conflicts, preventing violence, and maintaining morale, roles modern crisis psychologists would recognize as essential for group survival in confined conditions. Winter also temporarily reshaped marriage dynamics. While summer marriages focused on political alliances, winter survival often required more flexible arrangements. Some sagas describe winter marriages, temporary unions ensuring all community members had shelter and support during the harshest months. These weren't romantic relationships, but survival partnerships, dissolved when spring returned. Property rights reflected these seasonal realities. Women often controlled winter resources like food stores and fuel supplies, while men managed summer-oriented assets like ships and weapons. This created an economic balance where both genders held crucial leverage at different times of year, a system far more equitable than the male-dominated property structures of later medieval Europe. The loss of these gender-balanced systems was one of the most damaging consequences of Viking knowledge disappearance. As winter survival techniques faded, so did women's corresponding social authority. Later medieval Scandinavian societies became far more patriarchal, losing the nuanced gender dynamics that had made Viking communities so resilient. Modern reconstructions of Viking textile production reveal its staggering scale and importance. At the Ribe Viking Center in Denmark, Experimental archaeologists calculated that outfitting a single 30-person longhouse for winter required over 15,000 hours of textile work, the equivalent of 8 people working full-time for a year. This wasn't women's work in any trivial sense, but industrialized scale survival production. The nutritional knowledge Viking women commanded was equally impressive. Analysis of food remains shows they balanced diets carefully to prevent deficiency diseases, mixing preserved fish for protein with fermented greens for vitamins, and adding precise amounts of animal organs for micronutrients. This wasn't accidental, but sophisticated nutritional science developed through generations of observation. Childbirth management reached remarkable sophistication given the conditions. Viking midwives used sterile techniques, boiling water, clean linen, that wouldn't become standard in Europe for centuries. They employed herbal analgesics and had methods for difficult deliveries that reduced maternal mortality rates below medieval norms. This knowledge was particularly crucial for timing births away from winter's deadliest months. The psychological techniques women developed for winter group management anticipate modern crisis psychology. Viking women were masters of conflict de-escalation, using storytelling, ritual, and social pressure to prevent violence in confined spaces. Their approaches to maintaining morale through communal singing, games, and shared tasks kept groups functional under incredible stress. Modern attempts to recreate Viking winter communities consistently find that gender balance is crucial for success. Experiments where roles are divided along traditional Viking seasonal lines, with women assuming greater winter authority, show better survival outcomes and group cohesion than more hierarchical models. This confirms what Viking societies discovered empirically, that survival systems work best when they leverage all community members' strengths. The loss of Viking women's knowledge represents one of history's great intellectual tragedies. Their sophisticated understanding of nutrition, preventative medicine, textile science, and group psychology disappeared just when it could have benefited later generations. As with so much Viking knowledge, the disappearance wasn't due to inadequacy, but to social changes that eroded the context sustaining it. Today, as we confront new challenges of sustainability and resilience, Viking gender systems offer valuable models. Their seasonal balance of power, recognition of different survival skills, and equitable distribution of crucial responsibilities provide alternatives to both historical patriarchy and modern gender debates. The Vikings proved that extreme conditions demand all community members' full participation, a lesson we're still struggling to fully learn. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking experience shows that gender roles need not be static, but can adapt fluidly to environmental needs. Their society wasn't feminist by modern standards, but it developed remarkably balanced systems where survival needs dictated social structures rather than ideology. This pragmatic flexibility may be their most valuable legacy as we shape societies capable of weathering our own coming storms. The children of Viking winter settlements experienced childhood in ways that would shock modern sensibilities, yet produced remarkably capable adults. From the moment they could walk, Viking children were integrated into the survival economy, not as passive observers, but as active contributors to communal resilience. A 5-year-old might be entrusted with keeping watch over the night's fire embers, understanding that dozens of lives depended on their vigilance. 7-year-olds helped tend livestock in winter barns, their small hands adept at milking goats in frigid conditions. By 10, most children could set fishing nets under ice and identify which plants retain nutrients when dried for winter storage. This wasn't child labor in the exploitative sense, but a carefully calibrated survival pedagogy. Viking communities couldn't afford the modern luxury of prolonged childhood. Every able body needed to contribute to winter preparedness. But archaeological evidence suggests this system produced extraordinarily competent adults. Analysis of skeletal remains shows Viking children developed both fine motor skills for intricate tasks like net mending and impressive strength from young ages. Their bones show stress patterns similar to modern child athletes, evidence of hard work balanced with proper physical development. The psychological impacts were equally profound. Viking children learned early that their actions had real consequences for community survival. This wasn't theoretical. A child who neglected their fire-watching duties might wake to find grandparents frozen to death. Such harsh lessons created what modern psychologists call internal locus of control, the unshakable belief that one's actions directly influence outcomes. Viking sagas are filled with protagonists who persevere against impossible odds, reflecting this deeply ingrained mindset. Educational methods were perfectly adapted to winter constraints. With limited daylight for outdoor activities, Viking children spent long winter hours memorizing sagas that encoded survival knowledge. A single epic poem might contain navigation cues, weather prediction rhymes, and food preservation techniques woven into its verses. Modern researchers have identified over 200 distinct survival skills embedded in the poetic Edda alone, making these works the equivalent of interactive survival manuals. Socialization practices fostered both independence and cooperation. Children rotated between different households during winter months, preventing overburdening any single family while creating community-wide bonds. This system also served as primitive quarantine, isolating groups when illnesses appeared. The result was children who could adapt quickly to new social situations while maintaining strong communal ties, a balance modern education struggles to achieve. Discipline focused on practical consequences rather than abstract punishment. A child who spoiled stored food might go hungry alongside the community, learning through direct experience. Those who endangered others through carelessness faced social sanctions proportional to their actions. Archaeological finds include small wooden shame tokens that misbehaving children were required to wear, an early form of restorative justice emphasizing community reconciliation over retribution. The transition to adulthood came early but was carefully staged. At 12 to 14, adolescents underwent winter survival trials, spending nights alone in snow shelters, locating food caches in whiteout conditions, demonstrating mastery of essential skills. These weren't arbitrary hazing rituals, but carefully designed competency tests. Successful candidates earned adult privileges and responsibilities. Those who failed received targeted training rather than stigma. The physical toll of this childhood was visible, but not necessarily detrimental. Skeletal evidence shows Viking children had higher rates of minor frostbite damage and healed fractures than modern children, but also remarkably low rates of chronic malnutrition or growth stunting compared to other medieval populations. Their bones tell a story of hard use, but generally good care. Communities pushing children to their limits without breaking them. The psychological resilience this upbringing created was extraordinary. Viking sagas describe children maintaining composure during shipwrecks, leading lost groups to safety, or making calm life-or-death decisions under pressure, behaviors that would be remarkable in modern adults. This wasn't genetic superiority but trained capability, proof of what young minds can achieve when properly prepared. Seasonal rhythms created natural developmental cycles. Summer's relative freedom allowed for exploration and play, while winter's structured confinement focused on skill acquisition. Modern child development research confirms the value of such alternating periods. Vikings had discovered through necessity what science now verifies, that children thrive with balanced challenge and support. The loss of this childhood model was one of the most damaging consequences of Viking knowledge disappearance. Later medieval Scandinavian children, raised in more protected environments, lacked the survival skills their ancestors had mastered by adolescence. When harsh winters returned during the Little Ice Age, these less prepared generations suffered terribly, their vulnerability starkly contrasting with Viking-era resilience. Modern attempts to recreate elements of Viking childhood have yielded fascinating insights. At experimental archaeology sites like Vikings Museum in Sweden, children taught Viking-era skills consistently outperform modern peers in crisis simulations. They show better problem-solving under stress, more effective teamwork in emergencies, and calmer responses to unexpected challenges, suggesting Viking methods cultivated precisely the resilience modern parents seek. The educational implications are profound. Viking storytelling techniques, which wove factual knowledge into memorable narratives, anticipate modern cognitive science findings about memory and learning. Their practice of embedding survival skills in songs and rhymes parallels contemporary educational strategies for teaching complex information. We're only now scientifically validating methods Vikings developed through centuries of trial and error. Physical training methods were equally advanced. Viking children's alternating periods of intense activity and rest mirror modern athletic training regimens. Their progressive skill building, starting with small responsibilities and gradually increasing challenges, matches current understanding of skill acquisition. Even their use of deliberate cold exposure, routine outdoor activity in winter conditions, finds support in modern research on metabolic health and stress tolerance. Perhaps most impressive was the social adaptability Viking childhood fostered. Children raised in this system could fluidly transition between leadership and followership as situations demanded, a trait modern organizations spend millions trying to cultivate in adults. Their ability to maintain both individual initiative and group cohesion remains exceptional by contemporary standards. The Viking approach to risk management and child rearing offers particular food for thought. While exposing children to real consequences, they created layered safety nets. Older children supervising younger ones, multiple checks on critical tasks, and constant evaluation of individual capabilities. This wasn't reckless endangerment, but calculated challenge within carefully managed parameters. Modern parents grappling with how to balance safety and independence might find Viking models surprisingly relevant. Their system avoided both the helicopter parenting that leaves children unprepared for adversity and the neglect that exposes them to unnecessary danger. Instead, they cultivated what psychologists now call anti-fragility, the ability to grow stronger from appropriate challenges. As climate change makes extreme weather events more common, Viking childhood principles may gain new relevance. The skills their children mastered, emergency preparedness, resource management, crisis decision-making, are precisely those likely to matter most in an unstable future. Their example proves that even young children can develop remarkable resilience when properly guided. The ultimate lesson from Viking childhood may be one of trust, that children rise to the expectations set for them. Viking communities expected children to contribute meaningfully to survival, and children rose to meet those expectations. In our modern world, where we've largely eliminated survival pressures from childhood, we may have inadvertently deprived young people of opportunities to discover their own capabilities. The Viking experience suggests that children thrive not when protected from all hardship, but when given meaningful challenges they're prepared to meet. The architectural innovations Vikings developed for winter survival represent some of humanity's most ingenious adaptations to extreme environments. Their buildings weren't just shelters, but precisely calibrated life support systems, each element carefully engineered to conserve heat, manage moisture, and maintain livable conditions through months of relentless cold. Modern architects studying these structures are consistently astonished by their sophistication, solutions that rival contemporary energy-efficient designs while using only medieval technology. Longhouses, the backbone of Viking winter settlements, were marvels of environmental adaptation. Contrary to popular images of crude wooden huts, archaeological evidence reveals complex structures optimized through generations of refinement. The classic 20 to 30 meter longhouse wasn't an arbitrary shape, but a precise calculation of thermal efficiency, long enough to house extended families, yet narrow enough, 5 to 7 meters, to retain heat from a central fire. The bowed walls, often depicted in art as primitive construction, actually created convection currents that distributed warmth evenly while carrying smoke upward. Insulation techniques were remarkably advanced. Excavations show walls built with double layers of logs packed with insulating materials like moss, wool scraps, or even dried seaweed in coastal areas. Some settlements used primitive cavity walls, an air gap between inner and outer walls that provided insulation comparable to modern fiberglass. Floors were often raised on log foundations, creating a crucial buffer against ground frost while allowing warm air to circulate underneath. Roof designs show particular ingenuity. The characteristic steep pitch wasn't just aesthetic but functional, preventing snow accumulation that could collapse structures. Thatch layers could be over a meter thick in northern settlements, providing insulation that exceeds many modern building standards. Some roofs incorporated adjustable smoke holes with movable covers, an early form of climate control allowing precise regulation of temperature and airflow. The central fire pit was far more than a primitive hearth. Archaeological soil analysis reveals carefully designed combustion chambers that maximized heat output while minimizing fuel consumption. Stones surrounding the pit absorbed heat during the day, radiating warmth at night, an early thermal mass system. Positioning wasn't arbitrary. Fires were placed at specific points to create optimal convection currents, with seating arranged in precise zones based on temperature needs. Ventilation systems defied medieval norms. While most contemporary European buildings were smoke-filled death traps, Viking longhouses developed sophisticated air management. The combination of roof vents, wall vents, and carefully calculated internal airflow created what engineers now call stack ventilation, a system that removed smoke while retaining heat with remarkable efficiency. Some larger longhouses even show evidence of primitive duct systems channeling warm air to sleeping areas. Moisture control was equally innovative. The constant threat of condensation, from breathing, cooking, and melting snow for water, could have made longhouses uninhabitable. Viking builders addressed this through vapor barriers of animal hides lining walls, absorbent floor coverings changed regularly, and strategic placement of heat sources to prevent moisture accumulation. Archaeological evidence shows they understood dew points intuitively, positioning insulation to prevent problematic condensation. Community layouts reflected deep environmental understanding. Settlements were invariably positioned to maximize solar gain during winter months, with longhouse doors facing south where possible. Windbreaks of earthworks or carefully preserved tree stands protected northern exposures. Storage buildings were strategically placed to create snow fences that directed drifts away from living areas. The entire village functioned as an integrated climate control system. Specialized winter structures show even more targeted adaptations. Food storage buildings were designed as natural refrigerators, elevated on stilts to prevent ground heat transfer, with ventilated walls that allowed icy winds to circulate. Some northern sites reveal winter kitchens, semi-subterranean structures where communal cooking could continue without overloading longhouse humidity levels. Fishing stations incorporated wind-blocking walls and heated drying racks that functioned in temperatures far below freezing. The construction process itself was a marvel of winter adaptation. Vikings developed techniques for building in freezing conditions, using ice as a temporary scaffold material, employing frozen ground to their advantage for foundation work, and timing projects to leverage seasonal conditions. Some of their most durable structures were actually built during winter months, contrary to modern assumptions about medieval construction cycles. Material science was surprisingly advanced. Viking builders understood the thermal properties of different woods, selecting species based on insulation value rather than just availability. They developed treatments to improve wood's resistance to freezing and thawing cycles, tar coatings, strategic charring of surfaces, and specialized joinery that allowed for seasonal movement. Some settlements even imported particular stone types for their heat retention qualities. The social organization behind this construction was equally impressive. Large projects were timed for summer months when labor was available, but designed specifically for winter performance. Community-wide building bees brought together specialists in roofing, joinery, and insulation, a system resembling modern construction crews, but with every member trained through years of apprenticeship. The loss of this architectural knowledge was catastrophic for later generations. As Viking building techniques disappeared, medieval Scandinavians constructed homes that were markedly inferior for winter survival, more drafty, less insulated, and prone to moisture problems. Archaeological stratigraphy shows a clear decline in building quality corresponding with the loss of Viking-era knowledge, followed by increased evidence of winter-related health issues in skeletal remains. Modern attempts to recreate Viking buildings consistently surprise researchers. Instrumented tests show properly constructed longhouses can maintain comfortable temperatures, 10-15 degrees C/50-59 degree F, in freezing conditions with remarkably little fuel, sometimes just a few logs per day. Humidity levels stay within healthy ranges despite dozens of occupants, and air quality, measured by CO2 and particulate levels, rivals that in modern structures with mechanical ventilation. Energy efficiency is particularly striking. Comparative studies show Viking longhouses required about 0.5 to 0.7 cords of wood per winter month for heating, while later medieval buildings needed 2 to 3 times as much for similar comfort. This difference wasn't trivial. In deforested areas, it could determine whether a community survived winter or froze. The psychological impact of these spaces is equally noteworthy. Modern volunteers living in reconstructed longhouses report unexpected feelings of security and comfort despite the primitive conditions. The combination of warm colors, from firelight on wood, soothing airflow patterns, and communal spatial organization creates an environment that feels protective rather than confining, crucial for mental health during months of winter confinement. Contemporary architects are now mining Viking designs for sustainable building solutions. Their passive solar principles, natural ventilation strategies, and material efficiency anticipate modern green architecture by nearly a millennium. Some Norwegian firms are adapting Viking insulation techniques for modern energy-efficient homes with remarkable success. Perhaps most impressive is how holistically Viking architecture addressed human needs. These weren't just physical shelters, but spaces designed for social interaction, psychological comfort, and cultural continuity. The longhouse's central hearth wasn't just a heat source, but a social focal point. Sleeping alcoves provided privacy without isolation. Activity zones balanced communal living with individual needs. Every element served multiple purposes in a seamless integration of form and function. The ultimate lesson from Viking architecture may be about appropriate technology. Their solutions weren't about technical complexity, but about perfect adaptation to specific needs and environments. In an age of energy crises and climate change, this approach, maximizing efficiency through intelligent design rather than increasing resource consumption, may be their most valuable legacy. As we confront the need for sustainable housing in extreme environments, from Arctic communities to space habitats, Viking building science offers timeless principles. Their understanding that true resilience comes not from dominating nature, but from working intelligently with its forces and limits may be the key to surviving our own coming winters, whatever form they take. The disappearance of Viking winter survival knowledge created a technological dark age in Northern Europe that lasted centuries. As Viking settlements vanished and their ways were forgotten, later generations found themselves woefully unprepared for winter's fury. The archaeological record shows a stark decline in winter resilience. Buildings that leaked heat, food storage systems that failed, and communities that crumbled under conditions Viking children could have managed. This regression wasn't due to lack of intelligence or effort, but to the fragile nature of specialized knowledge when its cultural ecosystem disappears. What makes this loss particularly tragic is that Viking winter technologies were often more advanced than what replaced them. Medieval Scandinavians abandoned Viking insulation techniques for buildings that looked more modern, but performed worse in cold. They stopped the labor-intensive food preservation methods that ensured winter nutrition, leading to regular famine. Even simple innovations like windbreak walls and snow fences disappeared from settlements, leaving villages exposed to elements their ancestors had mastered. The economic consequences were devastating. Viking trade networks that operated year-round became seasonal as winter travel knowledge vanished. Settlements that had thrived as winter trading posts declined into poverty. The Norse Nar ships, specially reinforced for winter voyages, were replaced by vessels that couldn't safely navigate icy waters, shrinking economic horizons. Medical knowledge suffered equally. Viking treatments for frostbite, hypothermia, and winter illnesses, developed through generations of harsh experience, disappeared just when they were needed most. Later medieval accounts describe entire villages perishing from conditions Viking healers could have managed. Skeletal evidence shows increased frostbite damage and nutritional deficiencies in post-Viking populations. Psychological resilience similarly declined. Where Viking sagas describe communities maintaining cohesion through brutal winters, later chronicles tell of winter madness, violence, and despair. The sophisticated social systems and mental frameworks that had sustained Viking communities through darkness were lost, leaving people emotionally unprepared for seasonal hardships. The military implications were profound. Viking armies had routinely campaigned through winters that immobilized later medieval forces. Their winter warfare techniques, from ski troops to insulated field camps, gave strategic advantages no European army would regain until modern times. The loss of these capabilities reshaped Northern Europe's power dynamics for centuries. Perhaps most striking is how quickly this knowledge disappeared. Within a few generations of Viking society's decline, winter survival skills that had taken centuries to develop were reduced to fragments. By the time the Little Ice Age began in the 14th century, Europeans had forgotten how their ancestors thrived in even harsher conditions. Modern experimental archaeology reveals the full extent of this loss. When researchers attempt to recreate Viking winter settlements using only medieval, post-Viking technologies, the results are consistently disastrous. Buildings can't retain heat, food spoils prematurely, and communities fracture under stress. Precisely the problems historical records describe in post-Viking winters. The contrast is particularly stark in Greenland. Viking settlements there lasted nearly 500 years through gradually worsening conditions before disappearing in the 15th century. When Europeans returned in the 18th century with advanced technology, they couldn't match Viking survival rates. Early modern Greenland colonies suffered catastrophic winter mortality that Vikings had avoided for centuries. The nutritional regression was especially severe. Viking methods for preserving vitamins through winter, fermenting greens, careful meat drying techniques, strategic use of organ meats, were abandoned and forgotten. Later medieval Europeans suffered widespread scurvy and deficiency diseases that Viking-era skeletons rarely show. Clothing technology similarly regressed. Viking layered wool garments with waterproof leather outer shells provided better cold and wet protection than what most Europeans wore until the 19th century. The loss of textile knowledge left later generations shivering through winters their ancestors had weathered comfortably. Psychological coping mechanisms also deteriorated. Where Viking sagas describe communities maintaining morale through months of darkness, later accounts are filled with tales of winter depression and madness. The songs, stories, and social rituals that had sustained Viking mental health disappeared along with other survival systems. The most tragic aspect is that this knowledge loss was preventable. Viking technologies didn't fail. They were abandoned due to social and economic changes unrelated to their effectiveness. As communities became more connected to European trade networks and political systems, local survival knowledge seemed less important, until suddenly, catastrophically, it was desperately needed again. Modern climate researchers see disturbing parallels today. As Arctic indigenous communities integrate into global systems, their hard-won survival knowledge is disappearing just as climate change makes it most valuable. The Viking experience warns us that specialized adaptation systems can vanish long before the environments they were developed for change. The lessons for our era are profound. In an age of climate instability, we're relying on technologies and systems that may prove just as fragile as post-Viking winter adaptations. Our food distribution networks, energy infrastructure, and emergency services all depend on complex, interconnected systems that could unravel surprisingly quickly. The Viking collapse demonstrates that resilience isn't just about having technology, but about maintaining the cultural knowledge to use and adapt it. Their most advanced winter gear would have been useless without the skills to repair it, the social structures to distribute it, and the cultural values that made winter preparation a sacred duty. Perhaps the most important lesson is about humility. The Vikings weren't conquered or wiped out. They gradually abandoned the systems that made their survival possible, not realizing their importance until it was too late. In our confidence about modern technology's power, we risk repeating their mistake on a global scale. As we face increasing climate volatility, the Viking experience offers both warning and hope. The warning is that even the most advanced adaptations can disappear alarmingly fast. The hope is that humans are capable of extraordinary resilience when we maintain the knowledge and social systems that make it possible. The choice is ours whether to heed these lessons. Will we recognize the value of diverse survival knowledge before it's lost? Can we maintain the cultural ecosystems that sustain resilience? The Vikings' fate suggests that civilizations often don't realize what's truly essential until it's gone, a mistake we cannot afford to repeat. The final lesson from Viking winter survival is perhaps the most profound, that human resilience ultimately depends not on technology or individual prowess, but on the strength of community bonds and shared purpose. The Vikings who survived impossible winters weren't superhuman, nor were their tools magical. What set them apart was their ability to maintain social cohesion and cultural continuity in the face of relentless environmental pressures. When these intangible elements disappeared, even their most advanced technologies became useless. Modern research confirms what Viking experience demonstrated, that group survival in extreme conditions hinges on what sociologists call social capital, the networks of relationships and shared values that enable collective action. Viking winter settlements were case studies in social capital formation. Their complex systems of mutual obligation, resource sharing, and communal decision-making created resilience no individual could achieve alone. The psychological foundations of this resilience were remarkably sophisticated. Viking culture cultivated what modern psychologists term collective efficacy, the shared belief that a group can successfully execute courses of action required to achieve desired outcomes. This wasn't blind optimism, but hard-won confidence built through generations of overcoming winter's challenges. Their sagas weren't just entertainment, but psychological reinforcement, constant reminders of what their community could accomplish when united by common purpose. Cultural continuity served as the ultimate survival tool. Viking communities maintained detailed oral histories of past winters, which strategies had succeeded, which had failed, and why. This institutional memory allowed them to accumulate knowledge across generations in ways that written records alone couldn't achieve. The seasonal rituals marking winter's progression weren't just tradition, but vital psychological markers, ways to measure time's passage during months of darkness and maintain hope for spring's return. The loss of these intangible supports proved more devastating than any material lack. When Viking social structures fragmented under external pressures, their survival systems collapsed regardless of technical knowledge. Communities that retained the cultural framework could adapt tools and techniques to new circumstances. Those that lost the framework found even perfect tools useless without the social context that gave them meaning. Modern disaster research consistently echoes these Viking insights. Studies of communities surviving hurricanes, earthquakes, and other crises show that social cohesion predicts survival better than material resources alone. Groups with strong social ties and shared purpose routinely outperform better equipped but fragmented populations. The Vikings anticipated this understanding by nearly a millennium. The environmental implications are particularly urgent today. As climate change increases extreme weather events, we're rediscovering what Vikings knew instinctively, that technical solutions alone can't ensure resilience. Our advanced warning systems, fortified infrastructure, and stockpiled supplies mean little if communities lack the social bonds to implement survival plans when crisis hits. The Viking example suggests a path forward. Their winter preparations were never just practical tasks, but social rituals reinforcing interdependence. Food preservation wasn't just individual households storing meals, but entire communities working together on shared projects. Building repairs weren't just maintenance, but opportunities to teach skills and strengthen relationships. Every survival activity served dual purposes, meeting immediate physical needs while nurturing the social fabric that would see them through future challenges. This integrated approach holds powerful lessons for modern climate adaptation. Our tendency to silo survival planning, treating it as either technical problem solving or social work, misses the Viking insight that these domains are inseparable. Effective resilience requires systems where preparing for physical threats simultaneously strengthens community bonds, and where strengthening community bonds inherently improves crisis preparedness. The seasonal rhythm of Viking life offers another crucial insight. Their intense winter communality was balanced by summer's more individualistic activities, raiding, trading, and exploring. This alternation between collective and independent modes prevented social burnout while maintaining survival capabilities. Modern societies seeking sustainability might learn from this balance, finding ways to cycle between community-focused conservation and individual expression. The spiritual dimensions of Viking winter survival also merit attention. Their worldview saw humans as part of nature's cycles rather than separate from or superior to them. Winter wasn't an enemy to conquer, but a reality to be respected and accommodated. This humility before natural forces stands in stark contrast to modern assumptions about dominating our environment, assumptions that look increasingly dangerous as ecological crises deepen. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking experience proves that resilience can't be purchased or imposed. It must be cultivated organically within communities over time. Their winter survival systems weren't top-down impositions, but emergent properties of cultural values and daily practices. This suggests limits to what external aid can achieve in building climate resilience today. Real adaptation must grow from within communities, shaped by their specific values and circumstances. The ultimate tragedy of Viking knowledge loss is that it occurred just when it could have benefited most. The Little Ice Age that began in the 14th century brought conditions similar to what Viking systems were designed to handle. Had their knowledge remained intact, countless lives might have been saved. Instead, Europe suffered through centuries of avoidable winter catastrophes, famines, epidemics, and social collapses that Viking communities had learned to prevent. This historical warning resonates powerfully today. As we face climate disruptions of our own, we're similarly at risk of losing indigenous and local knowledge that could prove crucial for adaptation. The Viking experience urges us to recognize and preserve these knowledge systems before they disappear, not as museum pieces, but as living traditions that might help humanity weather coming storms. In the end, the Vikings' most enduring legacy may be their demonstration of what human communities can achieve when united by shared struggle. Their winter survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about finding meaning and even beauty in the challenge. The artifacts they left behind, intricately carved bone tools, poetry etched in driftwood, jewelry crafted during long nights, testify to creativity flourishing amid adversity. This spirit, the ability to face existential threats with both pragmatism and artistry, may be their greatest gift to future generations. As we confront our own planetary winter of climate change, we would do well to remember that survival depends not just on storing food and fuel, but on preserving what makes us truly human, our capacity to face darkness together and to kindle light not just for warmth, but for wonder. The Vikings who survived those endless winters would understand our current predicament better than we might expect. They knew what it meant to live with the knowledge that familiar comforts might not return, that spring wasn't guaranteed. Their solution wasn't despair, but determined preparation leavened by shared humanity. In their sagas, in their artifacts, in the very design of their longhouses, they left us a message across the centuries. Winter comes for every civilization. The question isn't whether we'll face it, but how. Will we face it fragmented and forgetful, or will we meet it as they did, with clear eyes, steady hands, and the unshakable conviction that no night lasts forever when people stand together against the cold?